A dark figure stood upon a tall tower, gazing out at the world below him. From his vantage point, he could see the city beneath and the countryside around it. Both were covered in swirling, shifting darkness, a tide that swept across the land and covered the buildings, leaving them in ruins. The figure watched, tall and powerfully built, massively muscled. He stood motionless upon the stone peak, his sharp eyes studying the scene below him. Long hair swung in braids about his chiseled face, the tasseled ends occasionally striking the long tusks that jutted up from his lower lip. The sun beat down on him, making his skin glow emerald in the light, and creating a glare from the many trophies and medallions he wore about his neck and across his broad chest. Heavy plates covered his chest, shoulders, and legs, their scarred surfaces gleaming black except where heavy bronze knobs studded them. Gold gleamed along the edges, proclaiming his importance. At last the figure had seen enough. He raised the enormous black warhammer he had been leaning upon, its stone head absorbing rather than reflecting the sunlight, and bellowed. It was a war cry, a summons and an exclamation, and the sound swept forth, slamming into the buildings and hills around him, echoing back. Below him, the dark tide ceased its movement. Then it rippled as faces turned upward. Every orc in the horde stopped and looked, staring up at the solitary figure high above. Again he shouted, his hammer held high, and this time the tide erupted in cheers and shouts and answering cries. The horde acknowledged its leader. Satisfied, Orgrim Doomhammer let his signature weapon drop back down to his side, and the dark tide below resumed its destructive motion. Down below, beyond the city's gates, an orc lay upon a cot. His short, scrawny frame was covered in thick furs, a sign of his high status, and rich clothes lay in a pile nearby. But the clothing had not been touched, not in weeks, for the orc lay without a stirring, as if dead, his ugly face scrunched in pain or concentration, his bushy beard bristling about his snarling mouth. Then suddenly, all changed. With a gasp, the orc sat bolt upright, the furs falling away from his sweat-drenched body. His eyes opened, glassy and unseeing at first, then blinking away the long sleep and glancing around him. "Where?" the orc demanded. A larger figure was already moving to his side, both heads registering pleased surprise, and as the orc's gaze caught him, the eyes sharpened, as did the features. Whatever confusion had lingered was gone, replaced by cunning and rage. "Where am I?" he demanded. "What has happened?" "You were asleep, Gul'dan," the other creature replied, kneeling by the cot and offering a goblet. The orc grabbed it, sniffed it, and tossed back the contents with a grunt, wiping a hand across his mouth afterward. "A sleep like death. For weeks now you have not moved, have barely breathed. We thought your spirit was gone." "Did you now?" Gul'dan grinned. "Were you afraid I would leave you, Cho'Gall? Abandon you to Black Hand's tender mercies?" The two-headed ogre mage glared at him. "Black Hand is dead, Gul'dan," one head snapped. The other frantically nodded in agreement. Dead? At first, Gul'dan thought he had misheard, but Cho'Gall's grim expressions convinced him even before both of the ogre's heads nodded. "What? How?" He pulled himself up to a sitting position, though the motion made him reel and break out in a cold sweat. "What has happened while I slept?" Cho'Gall began to answer, but his words died as someone thrust aside the tent flap and burst into the small, dim space. Two burly orc warriors shoved Cho'Gall out of the way and roughly grabbed Gul'dan's arms, hauling him to his feet. The ogre began to protest, rage darkening his twinning features, but two more orcs squeezed into the tight space and barred his path. Heavy battle axes at the ready. They stood guard as the first two dragged Gul'dan from the tent. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded, trying to wrest his arms free. It was no use, however. Even at full health, he would not have been a match for either warrior, and now he could barely hold himself upright. They were dragging him as much as leading him, and he saw that he was being taken toward a large, well-crafted tent, Black Hand's tent. He took control, Gul'dan, Cho'Gall said quietly, pacing beside him but staying beyond the warrior's reach. While you were unconscious, he attacked the Shadow Council and killed most of them. Only you and I and a few of the lesser warlocks remain. Gul'dan shook his head, trying to clear it. He still felt fuzzy, unfocused, and from what Cho'Gall said, this was not a good time to lack clarity. But what the ogre had said made him more confused rather than less. Killed Black Hand? Destroyed the Shadow Council? It was insane. Who? He demanded again, twisting to face Cho'Gall over the warrior's broad shoulders. Who did this? But Cho'Gall had slowed his steps, falling back, a look of surprised fear crossing both his faces. Gul'dan turned back around just as a powerful figure strode forward, and at once, seeing the massive warrior in his black plate armor, the colossal black warhammer held so easily in his hands, Gul'dan understood. Doomhammer. So you are awake, Doomhammer all but spat the words as the warrior stopped before him. They released Gul'dan's arms suddenly, and the orc warlock was unable to stop himself from crumbling to the ground. He looked up, on his knees, and gulped at the naked fury and hatred he saw in his captor's face. Gul'dan began, but Doomhammer cut him, backhanding him hard enough to lift him off the ground and drop him in a heap several feet away. Silence, the new horde leader snarled. I did not say you could speak. He strode closer, raising Gul'dan's chin with the head of his fearsome weapon. I know what you have done, Gul'dan. I know how you controlled Black Hand, you and your Shadow Council. He laughed, a harsh sound filled with bitterness and disgust. Oh yes, I know about them, but your warlocks will not help you now. They are dead, many of them, and the few who remain are chained and watched. He leaned closer. I rule the horde now, Gul'dan. Not you, not your warlocks. Doomhammer alone. And there will be no more dishonor, no more treachery, no more deceit and lies. Doomhammer rose to his full impressive height, towering over Gul'dan. Duratan died from your scheming, but he will be the last, and he will be avenged. No more will you rule our people from the shadows. No more will you control our fate and direct us for your own sordid purpose. Our people will be free of you. Gul'dan cowered, thinking fast. He had known Doomhammer could be a problem. The powerful orc warrior was too intelligent, too honorable, too noble to be easily swayed or controlled. He had been second to Black Hand, the powerful Black Rock leader Gul'dan had chosen as his puppet for the Horde leadership. Black Hand had been an extremely powerful fighter, but had thought himself clever, and thus had been easily controlled. Gul'dan and his Shadow Counselor had been the real powers, and Gul'dan had ruled the council as easily as he did their war chief. But not Doomhammer. He had refused to follow, carving his own path with reckless abandon, equaled only by his loyalty to their people. Clearly, he had seen what occurred behind the scenes, witnessed what he considered corruption, and when he had finally seen enough, when he could endure no more, he had acted. Clearly, Doomhammer had chosen this moment carefully. With Gul'dan out of the way, Black Hand would be vulnerable. How he had discovered the Shadow Council's location was unclear, but obviously he had done so and then eliminated most of them. Leaving Gul'dan, Cho'Gall, and who knew what others. And now he stood over Gul'dan, hammer raised, ready to destroy him as well. Wait, Gul'dan cried out, both hands raising automatically to shield his face and head from harm. Please, I beg you. That made Doomhammer pause. You, the mighty Gul'dan, beg. Very well, dog, beg. Beg for your life. The hammer had not lowered, but at least it had not fallen. I, Gul'dan, hated then. Hated him with a passion he had never known for anything but power itself. Yet he knew what he had to do. Doomhammer hated him as well for orchestrating his old friend Duratan's death, and for transforming their people from peaceful hunters to raving warmongers. Given even the slightest excuse, that Doomhammer would smash his skull in, coating itself with his blood and hair and brain. He could not allow that to happen. I bow to your might, Orgrim Doomhammer, he managed at last, pronouncing each word clearly and loud enough that all those nearby could hear him. I acknowledge you as war chief of the Horde, and I pledge myself to you. I will obey you in all things. Doomhammer grunted. You have never demonstrated obedience before, he pointed out sharply. Why should I believe you capable of it now? Because you need me, Gul'dan replied, raising his head to meet the war chief's glare. You have slain my Shadow Council, yes, and consolidated your power over the Horde. That is as it should be. Blackhand was not strong enough to lead us on his own. You are, and so you should have no need of a council. He licked his lips. But you do need warlocks. You need our magic, for the humans have magic of their own, and without us you will fall to their power. He shook his head. And you have very few warlocks left. Myself, Cho'Gall, and a handful of neophytes. I am too useful to kill simply for revenge. Doomhammer's lips pulled back in a snarl, but he lowered the hammer. For a moment he said nothing, simply glaring at Gul'dan, his gray eyes filled with hate. But finally he nodded. What you say is true, he admitted, though the words clearly took enormous self-control to utter. And I will place the needs of the Horde over my own. He bared his tusk. I will allow you to live, Gul'dan, you and those of your warlocks who remain, but only as long as you prove useful. Oh, we will be useful, Gul'dan assured him, bowing low. His mind was already working. I will create for you a host of creatures such as you have never seen before, mighty Doomhammer, warriors who will serve you alone. With their might and our magic, we will crush this world's magi, even as the Horde tramples its warriors into the dust. Doomhammer nodded, his snarl fading to a thoughtful frown. Very well, he said at last. You have promised me warriors who can combat the humans' magic. I will hold you to that. Then he turned and walked away, clearly dismissing him. The orc warriors departed as well, leaving Gul'dan still on his knees with Cho'Gall not far away. The orc warlock thought he heard them laughing as they left. Damn him, Gul'dan thought, watching the war chief disappear back into his tent. And damn that human wizard as well. Gul'dan shook his head. Perhaps he should be cursing his own impatience instead. It had been that which had driven him to enter Medivh's mind, seeking the information the mages had promised, but thus far withheld from him. And it had merely been bad luck that Gul'dan had been inside Medivh's mind when the human had died, his own spirit weakened by the sudden violence. He had been trapped, unable to return to his body all this time, unaware of the world around him, and that had given Doomhammer the opportunity to seize control. But now at last he was awake again, and once more he could pursue his plans, because at least that desperate, dangerous act had not been wasted. Gul'dan had the information he needed, and soon he would not need Doomhammer or the Horde any longer. Soon he would be all-powerful without them. Gather the others, he told Cho'Gall, pushing himself off the ground and testing his limbs. He was weak, but he would manage. He had no time to do otherwise. I will forge them into a clan in truth, one that will serve my own ends and protect me from Doomhammer's wrath. They shall be Storm Reavers, and they will show all the Horde what we warlocks can accomplish, even as Doomhammer cannot deny their worth. Gather your clan as well. Cho'Gall led the Twilight's Hammer clan. They were obsessed with the end of the world, but were fearsome fighters. There is much to do. Despite himself, Lothar was impressed. Stormwind had been a towering, imposing city, filled with spires and terraces, carved from strong stone to resist the wind, but polished to a mere sheen. But in its own way, Capital City was equally lovely. Not that Capital City was the same as Stormwind. It was not as tall, for one, but what it lacked in height, it made up for in elegance. It sat on a rise above the north shore of Lordimir Lake, gleaming all in white and silver. It did not glitter as Stormwind had, but it glowed somehow, as if the sun were rising from its graceful buildings instead of beating down upon them. It seemed serene, peaceful, almost holy. It is a mighty place, Khadgar agreed beside him, though I prefer a little more warmth. He glanced behind them, toward the lake's southern shore, where a second city rose. Its outlines were similar to those of Capital City, but this mirror image seemed more exotic. Its walls and spires surfaced in violet and other warm hues. That is Dalaran, he explained, home of the Kirin Tor and its wizards, my home before I was sent to Medivh. Perhaps there will be a time for you to return, at least briefly, Lothar suggested. But for now, we must concentrate on Capital City. He studied the gleaming city again. Let us hope that they are as noble in their thoughts as they are in their dwellings. He kicked his horse into a canter and rode down out of the majestic silver pine forest, Varian and the mage right behind him, and the other men trailing them in their carts. 2 hours later, they reached the main gates. Guards stood by the entrance, though the double gates were wide open and large enough for 2 or even 3 wagons to pass abreast. The guards had clearly seen them long before they reached the gates, and the one who stepped forward wore a crimson cloak over his polished breastplate and his gold traceries in his armor and helmet, and had gold traceries in his armor and helmet. His manner was polite, even respectful, but Lothar could not help noticing how the man stopped only a few feet away, well within sword range. He forced himself to relax and ignore the laxity. This was not Stormwind. These people were not seasoned warriors, hardened by constant battle. They had never had to fight for their lives, yet. Enter freely and be welcome, the guard captain stated, bowing. Marcus Redpath warned us of your arrival and your plight. You will find the king in his throne room. Our thanks, Khadgar replied with a nod. Come, Lothar, he added, nudging his horse with his heels. I know the way. They rode on through the city, navigating its broad streets easily. Khadgar did not seem to know the way, and never slowed to ask directions or puzzle over a turn until they had reached the palace itself. There they surrendered their horses to some of their companions, leaving them to mind the steeds. Lothar and Prince Varian were already striding up the palace's wide steps, and Khadgar quickly joined them. They stepped through the palace's outer doors and into a wide courtyard, almost an outdoor hall. Viewing boxes lined the sides, and though empty now, Lothar was sure they filled with people during celebrations. At the far end, another short flight of steps led up to a second set of doors, and these opened onto the throne room itself. It was an imposing chamber, its arched ceilings so high overhead its edges were lost in shadow. The room was round with arches and columns everywhere. Golden sunlight streamed down from a stained glass panel set in the ceiling center, illuminating the intricate pattern in the floor. A series of nested circles, each one different, with a triangle at their middle overlapping the innermost ring. And the golden seal of Lordaeron within that. It had several high balconies, and Lothar guessed these were for the nobles, but also appreciated their strategic value. A few guards with bows could easily strike anywhere in the room from those vantage points. Just beyond the pattern stood a wide circular dais, its concentric steps rising up toward a massive throne. The throne itself looked carved from glittering stone, all sharp edges and planes and angles. A man sat there, tall and broad, his blonde hair only lightly touched with gray, his armor gleaming, the crown upon his head shaped more like a spiked helmet than a coronet. This was a proper king, Lothar knew at once. A king like his Lane who did not hesitate to fight for his people. His hopes rose at the thought. There were people here, townsfolk and laborers, and even peasants, gathered facing the dais from a respectful distance. Many carried items, scraps of parchment, even food, but they parted before Lothar and Khadgar, falling away from the pair without a sound. Yes, said the man on the throne. Yes, the man on the throne called out as they approached. Who are you, and what do you wish of me? Ah, even from here Lothar could see the king's strangely colored eyes, blue and green swirled together. They were sharp and clear, and his hopes rose still further. Here was a man who saw well and clearly. Your Majesty, Lothar replied, his deep voice carrying easily across the large room. He stopped several paces from the dais and bowed. I am Anduin Lothar, a knight of Stormwind. This is my companion, Khadgar of Dalaran. He heard several murmurs from the crowd now behind them. And this, he turned so that the king could see Varian, who had been standing beside him, unnerved by the crowd and the strange trappings, is Prince Varian, heir to the throne of Stormwind. The murmurs turned to gasps as people realized the youth was visiting royalty, but Lothar ignored them, concentrating only on the king. We must speak with you, Your Majesty. It is a matter of great urgency and major import. Of course. Tyrannus was already rising from his throne and approaching them. Leave us, please, he asked the rest of the crowd, though it was an order despite its polite wording. The people obeyed quickly, and soon only a handful of nobles and guards remained. The men who had accompanied Lothar faded back to the sides as well, leaving only Lothar, Khadgar, and Varian when Tyrannus closed the distance between them. Your Majesty, Tyrannus greeted Varian, bowing to him as an equal. Your Majesty, Varian replied, his training overcoming his shock. We were grieved to hear of your father's death, Tyrannus continued gently. King Lane was a good man, and we counted him as a friend and an ally. Know that we shall do all in our power to restore you to your throne. I thank you, Varian said, though his lower lip trembled slightly. Now come and sit and tell me what has happened, Tyrannus instructed, gesturing to the dais steps. He sat on the top of one himself and motioned for Varian to sit beside him. I have seen Stormwind myself and admired its strength and beauty. What could destroy such a city? The Horde, Khadgar said, speaking for the first time since they had entered the throne room. Tyrannus turned toward him, and Lothar was close enough to see the king's eyes narrow slightly. The Horde did this. And what is this Horde? Tyrannus demanded, turning first to Varian and then to Lothar. It is an army. More than an army, Lothar replied. It is a multitude, more than can be counted, enough to cover the land from shore to shore. And who commands this legion of men? Tyrannus asked. Not men, Lothar corrected, orcs. At the king's puzzlement, Lothar explained, a new race, not one native to this world. They are as tall as we are, and more powerfully built, with green skin and glowing red eyes, and great tusks from their lower lips. A noble snorted somewhere, and Lothar turned, glaring. You doubt me, he shouted, turning toward one of the balconies in turn, looking for the one who had laughed. You think I lie? He struck his armor with his fist, near one of the more prominent dents. This was made by an orc warhammer. He struck another spot, and this by an orc war axe. He pointed to a gash along one forearm, and this came from a tusk, when one jumped me and was too close for our blades to strike one another. These foul creatures have destroyed my land, my home, my people. If you doubt me, come down here and say it to my face. I will show you what sort of man I am, and what happens to those who accuse me of falsehood." Enough, Tyrannus' shout silenced any possible reply, anger plain in his own voice. But when he turned to Lothar, the warrior could see that this king's anger was not directed at him. "Enough," the king said again, more softly. "None here doubt your word, champion," he assured Lothar, a stern look around daring any of his nobles to disagree. "I know of your honor and your loyalty. I will take you at your word, though such creatures sound strange to us." He turned and nodded at Khadgar, "And with one of the wizards of Dalaran besides you as a witness, we cannot discount what you say, nor the notion of races we have never seen here before." "I thank you, King Tyrannus," Lothar replied formally, reining his anger back in. He was not sure what to do next. Fortunately, Tyrannus was. "I will summon my neighboring kings," he announced. "These events concern us all." He turned back toward Varian. "Your Majesty, I offer you my home and my protection for as long as you shall need it." He stated long enough for all to hear. "When you are ready, know that Lord Daron will assist you in reclaiming your kingdom." Lothar nodded. "Your Majesty, you are most generous," he said on Varian's behalf, "and I can think of no safer and finer place for my prince to reach his maturity than here in Capital City. I know, however, that we did not come here merely for sanctuary. We came to warn you." He stood tall, his voice rumbling across the room, his eyes not leaving Lord Daron's king. "For know this, the Horde will not stop at Stormwind. They mean to claim the entire world, and they have the might and the numbers to make that dream a reality. Nor do they lack magical might. Once they have finished with my homeland," his voice grew deeper and rougher, and forced himself to continue, "they will find a way across the ocean, and they will come here." "You are telling us to prepare for war," Tyrannus said quietly. It was not a question, but Lothar answered it nonetheless. "Yes." He looked around at the assembled men. "A war for the very survival of our race."